The only problem with Microsoft is they just have no taste. I know Bill would get upset with me for saying this. They have absolutely no taste. I don't mean that in a small way, I mean that in a big way. They don't think of original ideas, and they don't bring much culture into their product. Their products have no spirit of enlightenment about them. They are very pedestrian. And the sad part is that most customers don't have a lot of that spirit either. But the way that we're going to ratchet up our species is to take the best and to spread it around to everybody so that everybody grows up with better things and starts to understand the subtlety of these better things. And Microsoft's just, it's McDonald's. That's what saddens me. Not that Microsoft is one, but that Microsoft's products don't display more insight and more creativity.
The story of Apple's success goes back only 4 years when this man, Steve Jobs, then 21 years old, with fellow inventor Steve Wozniak designed their own computer named Apple because Steve just happens to like fruit and they were stuck for a name.
Steve Jobs is no ordinary figure, and this is no ordinary story. On the one hand, this is one of the most inspiring tales you'll ever hear, how a man offered simplicity in a world drowning in complexity, making technology feel human, cool, and sacred. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a prophet of the digital age who built an empire that sold dreams. But there's also a very dark story here, how a man who demanded perfection often crossed the line, leaving behind a trail of shouting matches behind closed doors, designers pushed past exhaustion, and colleagues discarded like faulty hardware. This is also a story about how Jobs faced incredible personal and professional challenges, was kicked out of his own company, and yet returned to Apple into the most valuable company in the world. There are very few figures with as many conflicted narratives and a legacy so deeply entwined with both brilliance and cruelty. It's time we delve into the truth. Welcome to the insane true story of Steve Jobs. To the world, Steve Jobs was more than a businessman. He was an artist in a black turtleneck. He was the man who would walk on stage, hold up a rectangle, and make the crowd gasp. He projected an image of flawless genius, and to millions, he was a prophet of the digital age. We saw the polished surfaces, the standing ovations, the cinematic ads, but what we didn't see was the cost, the myth he built, a narrative of genius and destiny, because the truth is Steve Jobs wasn't perfect, he was human, and sometimes he was cruel. This is where the story begins, not with what we saw, but with what we never looked for. Steve Jobs believed in greatness, and for him it wasn't a goal, it was a non-negotiable at Apple. There were no safety nets, no room for mediocrity, and no tolerance for good enough. Jobs demanded brilliance, not politely but relentlessly. He could walk into a room, glance at a project and you spent months on, and say it's shit, cold, brutal, final. To some, it was motivational. To others, it was a psychological war zone. One engineer recalled being called a bozo in front of his entire team. A designer remembered having his work thrown back at him without a word, and yet they stayed, because under that pressure something strange happened. They got better, faster, sharper. They did the best work of their lives because Jobs forced them to. He saw people as tools in service of the vision. If you couldn't keep up, you were out. If you challenged him, you were shut down. He once told a team working on the original Mac, real artists ship. But to ship on time, they sacrificed sleep, weekends and families. Some broke down, some burned out, some never came back. So we're left with a question that's hard to answer. Is that kind of leadership visionary or toxic? Jobs didn't build Apple with kindness, he built it with pressure, with confrontation, with the unwavering belief that anything less than perfect was worthless. This was the cost of excellence in Jobs' world, not just sweat, not just time, but dignity, stability, human limits. He was a master of connecting the world, but when it came to the people closest to him, Steve Jobs often failed to connect at all. Behind the genius was a pattern of distance. Let's start with Lisa, his daughter. Jobs denied her for years, despite the DNA and despite naming a computer after her. Her mother was on welfare while Steve Jobs was worth millions. It wasn't until years later, after the immense pressure, that he accepted her. But the wounds of being rejected by your own father never fully close. That's when there was Steve Wozniak, the man who helped start it all. Woz was the heart, Jobs was the edge, and when Apple exploded, Jobs took the spotlight, the control, and many say the credit. Wozniak eventually walked away in quiet disappointment. This pattern continued. He would pull people in close, then push them away when they no longer served the mission. Relationships were tools, and when they broke, he didn't fix them, he replaced them. For Steve Jobs, love and loyalty were conditional. They bent to the demands of his vision, not the other way around. In 1985, the unthinkable happened. Steve Jobs, the face of Apple, the man who started it all, was forced out of his own company. It wasn't dramatic, it was surgical, a slow, quiet unraveling, until one day, the boardroom that had once applauded his brilliance turned cold. He was 30 years old, a visionary, a millionaire, and suddenly, a man without a stage. To the world, it looked like the end, but for Jobs, it was the beginning of something else. He started a new company, Next, pouring everything into it, obsessing over every detail. Though it sold poorly, NEXT was planting seeds. Its software would one day become the foundation for Mac and iOS. Jobs didn't just walk away from the future, he quietly engineered it from the shadows. At the same time, he bought a tiny animation studio, Pixar, from George Lucas, and with it, rewrote the rules of storytelling. When Toy Story hit the theaters in 1995, it wasn't just a box office success, it was a cultural reset. He had reinvented himself not with noise, but with patience, not by seeking redemption, but by staying relentless. When Apple came calling in 1997, broken, bankrupt, and out of ideas, Jobs returned as not a dreamer, but as a force. He came back leaner, tougher, with scars of exile still fresh, and the fire still burning. The world thought they had seen Steve Jobs at his peak, but the man who came back was colder, wiser, and far more dangerous. His exile wasn't a failure, it was a forge, and what emerged from that fire wasn't the same Steve Jobs. Within months, dozens of projects were cancelled, entire teams were dismantled, and people let go without warning. One employee said, "Working at Apple under Steve was like living in a pressure cooker. You either rose to the top or burned alive." Jobs demanded silence, loyalty, precision. Apple became the fortress of secrecy, where even engineers didn't know what the person next to them was building. Mistakes were punished, ideas were shredded, and excellence was the only currency that mattered. He once told an employee their idea was the worst thing he'd ever seen, and he walked out of the boardroom. Another engineer said they worked 90 hours a week just to hear "not bad" from Steve. But here's the twist, it worked. Under Jobs' rule, Apple didn't just recover, it became the most valuable company in the world. The iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, one by one he dropped miracles onto the world stage. But behind each project was a team that had pushed to their limits. Some called it visionary leadership, others called it a culture of fear. Employees lived on the edge of burnout, paranoia ran deep, yet the results were undeniable. Jobs had turned Apple into a machine of innovation, fueled by obsession, maintained by fear, and led by a man who refused to compromise. But with every victory, the question grew louder: at what cost? Because while the world applauded the genius on stage, the people behind the curtain were still catching their breath. Jobs returned not to play nice, but not to forgive, but to finish what he had started, even if it meant breaking everyone along the way. Then in 2003, Steve Jobs received the call that no visionary, no matter how powerful, could escape pancreatic cancer. It was a rare, slow-moving, and treatable form, or so he told himself. In a desperate attempt to defy his ultimate convention, Jobs tried to fight the illness on his own terms, delaying surgery for 9 months and turning to alternative therapies like fruit diets and herbal treatments. During his critical period, the cancer grew. Even in the face of death, Jobs was still trying to bend reality, but something profound began to change within him. As his body began to weaken, a profound shift occurred. His perspective deepened. The man who once controlled everything, teams, products, futures, was now confronting the loss of control over the one thing that truly mattered: time. This existential challenge forced a period of deep reflection. He began to reckon with his past, the mistakes, the cruelty, and the relationships he had broken. In a dramatic turning point, he reconciled with his daughter Lisa, striving to repair what years of silence had shattered. He spent more time with his wife, Lorene, and their children, realizing that the quiet moments he once dismissed as distractions were, in fact, sacred. The hard edges of personality, once so sharp, began to soften. The man who had relentlessly chased external perfection started to learn acceptance. of imperfection in himself and in those around him. His famous Stanford commencement speech became a testament to his transformation, where he spoke not as a tech titan, but as a man acutely aware of his own finite story, discussing failure, love, loss, and an imperative of following one's intuition because the time is limited. For a moment, the myth of Steve Jobs gave way to something unequivocally real, just a man grappling with the one truth he could never outthink. On October 5th, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away at the age of 56 while billions mourned a legend and held the devices he had imagined in their hands. Those closest to him grieved a man who had, in his final years, finally started to return to them. Mortality did not simply take Steve Jobs, it transformed him, granting him a perspective that even his unparalleled success never could. Steve Jobs was no ordinary visionary, and his story is no ordinary tale. On one hand, it's one of the most inspiring sagas of a man who didn't just dent the universe, but reshaped it, transforming how we communicate, listen, and live, turning computers into companions and design into philosophy. Yet there's also a very dark story here, one of an obsessive genius whose monumental achievements often came at the expense of kindness, patience, and truth. Today, people dissect his leadership like scripture, with countless books, podcasts, and business schools attempting to extract a magic formula for his success. Yet the sources clarify there is no such formula. There is only the complex reality of a man who is brilliant, difficult, exacting, and profoundly human. His dark side was never a footnote. It was an inseparable part of his narrative, highlighting the constant tension between creation and destruction, empathy and obsession, and the profound impact of changing the world while at times hurting people along the way. His legacy is not meant to be perfect, it's meant to be honest, revealing the full spectrum of his genius and flaws, with every contradiction exposed. Ultimately, Steve Jobs still stands as one of the most powerful reminders of what humans are capable of achieving, both better and for worse.